Just want to welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. We are joined today by a very special guest, Neil Smith, who is the Director of Consulting for Fifth World. I'm going to be diving into soil health and what exactly that is. So, without any more delay, I'll kind of let Neil take it over from here. Go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Pleasure to be here. You might notice that my title is a little bit different than what Ben just mentioned. We've had a bit of a naming convention at Fifth World, and we've gone to trying to remove the word consulting. We found it a little bit constraining to what we actually do, which is a little more holistic and multi-domain focused. So regenerative property design is a better fit all around. And we still cover the broad spectrum of different aspects that filter into regenerative. So whether it's energy, whether that is dwellings or land and soils, which is what we're going to be speaking about today, we take a look at all those aspects. I'm very privileged to be working with a terrific team that brings a lot of different expertise in a lot of different areas, really leaning into that multi-domain capability and how we look at our ecosystems and how we plan them and then design them. It's ultimately what we really like to do. For us, it's continuously trying to understand how we can have assets be multi-purpose as opposed to single, and whether that is enhancing an energy grid, decentralized energy grid, or taking a look at the dwellings that we live in or the outbuildings that we use or irrigation systems. And even the soils can be multi-use in terms of how we work with them, as opposed to try to control them. My background, just to give you some context, it has been in agriculture my whole life. I grew up in a blueberry farm out in BC, so there's a few of you joining from the British Columbia market space, whether on the coast or interior there, but I grew up on the coast, up in a little place called Whistler. You may have heard of it back in the day. So I had a blueberry farm there that I grew up on. I moved my way out to the prairies of Canada and have been heavily involved in everything from broadacre, very what I would consider conventional agriculture, and then all the way through the vertical supply chain. One of the things that I got infected with, I started drinking the Kool-Aid of regenerative agriculture probably about 10 years ago, and I've just done a deep dive into how I can continue to bring this knowledge base forward. And I think about regenerative a little bit larger than what the core principles of regenerative agriculture are. Again, very much designing a system of systems approach that is self-regenerating. So it includes sustainability models, organic models, but all of it, doesn't matter what wonderful methodology that we utilize or what system we apply, all of it hinges on soil and our connectivity with the soil and how we work with soil. And so today, I just really want to share a little bit about the basics of soils, and some of this might be knowledge that you already know, some of it might be new knowledge, and then at the end of the presentation, happy to answer any and all the questions that I'm sure will come in many different ways. So I know there's a large span of different engagement with soil and experiences and even education. My hope here is that we all take away one or two things that we can think about and how we interact with the ecosystems that we are living within, and particularly the soils that we touch. So we'll dive right into it. What is soil? Soil is typically defined in a number of different ways. A lot of us forget about the functionality of how we engage with soil and how we talk about soil. Soil to us can be a secondary nature to the plants that we're growing or the earthworks that we're enacting with projects. But the three typical sort of main definitions around soil: utilitarian, ecological, and pedological. We spend a lot of time in utilitarian and ecological conversations, but I will get into the pedology of it a little bit here just in premise of trying to bring some edification to this lunch and learn. So when we think about utilitarian, this very much is around the engineering, the agricultural components of defining soil. Soil can be functional, it can be depleted, it can be degraded, but typically it has properties, when we think about it from a utilitarian standpoint, around engineering, so how we manipulate it for our own uses. A lot of that would be a agricultural basis, but irrigation, housing, city works, earthworks all come into play. And another way to think about utilitarian function is soil as a material, and so less about how we work with it or manipulate it, and more about the output that we get from it. And so the characteristics that we find in soils that we've taken into science behind soil and how we utilize that in our everyday world, or even the uses from it in terms of fibers that we get from it. So we can think about soil as a material. Today we're thinking about soil in different ways in terms of even surrounding our passive houses or creating some stability in high compression soil function. But all of it is a utilitarian sort of description around soil. The ecological, and this is really where I spend a lot of my time, and I will note, I'm not a soil scientist. I haven't got any letters behind my name around soil. I know there's a few of you on here that definitely had that educational background, and I really much value those that knowledge and experience, and would welcome any questions that take on to any of what I'm presenting today. My experience is very much practical, and years of playing around on my own farm and from my education and the different ventures that have taken me across North America and into Europe and a little bit to South America around the different soil types. And when it comes to the ecological component, a lot of that has been focused on plants, what we grow, and that could be indoor in our own homes. How does soil function as a respiratory to our climate? How does it capture some of those bad microorganisms in the air through the plant structures and take them down? How do we use soils, or how do we find soils that are in the basement suites of our houses that encroaching into our water systems or waste systems, and how do we play around with that? But plant structure in particular is something that I very much like to focus on as it engages with soil. So the ecological definition around plant support is very much a definition around soil that I talk about a lot. Water transfer, water absorption rate, infiltration rate. A lot of times we think about living soils that are functioning without a lot of human input. And one of the things I like to talk about is how it is interacting with water, and whether it's taking water, absorbing water. In the eastern seaboard of Canada, we've had a wetter, which is where I'm based right now in Toronto. We've had a wetter summer than we've typically had, and we've had a couple flash floods happen. We've had a lot of water runoff, and captured within that water is a lot of soil degradation, soil that hasn't been well tended to, hasn't been covered. And we're actually seeing a lot of brown streams, brown waterways feeding out into our lakes and riverways. And that's all soil that is not working effectively with its interaction with water. And then nutrient transfer. We can't forget about the highway that soil produces for plants in particular, but also for just creating functional soil health. So this is a term that, if I was to quiz you after this presentation, I'd like you to underline and put an exclamation mark at the end of it. Soil health, I want you to think about it as functional soil health. We really want soil to be functional, not just healthy. Soil can be healthy, but not produce functional components that we need in terms of our growing. So functional soil health is really where I really like to focus my attention in terms of the wordsmithing and the vernacular that goes around that. But underpinning that is the highway, the transfer of nutrients that need to happen, and soil plays an instrumental part on that. The pedagogical definition of soil is a complex system of systems. At the odds there's a bit of a spelling mistake, formed through various natural processes. And really, when we think about soil, it truly is the hardest system of systems to work with, to design, to play with, and we're so dependent on it. It continues to share with us its evolution and its adaptation to how we as humans are working with it in a number of different ways. Agriculture being a huge component of our food supply system, both indoor and outdoor agriculture. But a system of systems, the most complex system of systems, that's what soil is. And we really look at that through a couple of key processes, whether that's the weathering of soil and understanding that soil ages over time and that we have different interactions with it as it ages, the organic matter that we put into it. So a lot of times when we think about organic matter, we think about composting. And so we think about adding our organic waste into the soil and that it's just going to create a lush, dark soil for us to work with. By and large, that is a great theory, and it has a lot of aspects of truism to it. On the other side of that, I do always want us to be aware that organic, if it's coming from very processed, has components of heavy metals, has components of toxicity that we see integrated into our soil. So we need to be thinking about the man-made components of what we think are organic as it interacts with soil, but pedagogically, weathering, organic matter accumulation, and then leaching, so that runoff of the soil, the leaching effects that happen in different soil types and typically sandier, non-loamy soils would make up a definition around the soil formation. And soil does have a number of different unique characteristics that as we age, we'll see change over time, just like us humans or anything that is living. Then I do notice there might be some questions there. If there's anything that stands out, just ping me here. I haven't quite read them, and I will get to those questions. I'll move to pause here and read them in just a second. When we think about the service of soil, and again, I know I'm going through some of the rudimentary basics, but I think it's important to understand, that the definitions that help us understand the serviceability, what it produces for us, and then how we interact with it. So there's a madness to the method and how I try to present some of the information. Food and fiber production. Food being a key component of how we interact with soil and how we typically know a soil from an agricultural standpoint. Nowadays, we hear more and more about nutrient density. Nutrient density is just an output of how well we are creating functional soil health. So the less we put in terms of inputs, and it doesn't matter if it's nature-based inputs, the more we allow nature to regenerate and be self-sustaining, the more that highway of nutrient transfer happens independently of us human involvement. And the more nutrient uptake, the right things coming up the root stems of plants are going to create better and tastier food for all of us. Whether legumes, vegetables, fruits, stone fruits, grains in general, and even the livestock that grazes off the grasses in the green photosynthesis chlorophyll that happens because of what's going in the soil. Just to let you know, there's specific nutrients, there's specific micronutrients that are in soils that produce the chlorophyll, produce the greenness that we see in our grasses and in the green plants. And it's very important that observation as we look at our different ecosystems, when we see yellowing, when we see browning of our plants, it typically is an indication of something that isn't happening in our soils. And it would be those nutrients that are either depleted or being affected in some way. Just as a caveat, one of the neat things that I see happen in vineyards, at the top of a vineyard row, they actually plant rose bushes. And rose bushes are very, very susceptible to what's happening below the soil and all the deficiencies and positives that happen with our micro organism community within the soils. And so when the rose bushes start to wilt or they produce a sick looking plant, it's typically an indication that there's something going on in the soils. And before it affects the vine, which has a different bit of a root structure, has a little more leeway, we can actually go and do some soil testing and analysis. So it's using nature to be very visually aware of what's happening below our feet with a crop type that is producing wonderful wines and other grape outputs that we see from vineyards. Other soil services, environmental filtration. I talked about that a little bit quickly in the definitions. Soil respires just like us humans, and so it takes in and it gases off different elements. And so within our homes, we need to think about soils as both positive to air filtration, but also potentially could have a negative effect and respire toxicity if we're not caring for the soil and the living matter that is probably planted into the soils there. So environmental control, environmental health with soil is something that we need to take into account. Water management, by and large, soil acts as a water capture system, and there's some staggering numbers about how much soil can hold water. A lot of that is due to the carbon effect and the microorganisms, the worms working well, creating portals or holes, porousness within the porosity is a term within the soil that holds water for us. And we need to see more water being held within the soil, not leaching off and not spilling into our waterways. And so creating a combination of carbon sequestration to help with that, but also working with understanding what kind of soil types we have and water management within our soils is very, very important. So when I think about water management, we go to the human aspects. A lot of that is irrigation. So dry land agriculture brings in pivots or brings in irrigation systems. And if you're not taking into account what kind of soils you're working on, that water can just flow through and can actually take away all the positive elements within the soils that are feeding the crops. And so we get into this vicious circle of chasing the tail of adding more inputs to help counteract what's happening. So we need to help regenerate the soils very much on those standpoints. When we think about earthwork, when we're building our homes or dwellings, when we're urban city planners, creating parks, we do need to think about how we manage water as it relates to the soils. Soils can get waterlogged. They can create some negative effects. Still water produces a lot of mosquitoes in terms of a home that houses different animal structures, but it also can provide a lot of positives as well in terms of aquaculture. So just like we do with bare soil, I think about soil that is a bit waterlogged before it turns into a bog. We can actually create elements of utilization and working with it, either to regenerate and filter the water more effectively, or create a different ecosystem there that is preserving the water. So thinking about water management with soil systems is very important. And then the last one I put in there is carbon sequestration. We hear about carbon nowadays all the time as it relates to climate. I want you to think beyond just the climate as a whole and carbon as an element of negativity. Carbon sequestration is just a component of interaction with soil and the sequestration part. And so we need to create an environment where carbon is held within soils, and that actually will help us create a better mitigation within the soil for the water leaching out, the microorganisms, the nutrients not doing what they need to. So carbon is a key indicator for functional soil health. That is probably the number one element for functional soil. There's many others, but as a key indicator when we're doing soil testing, and you can do simple ones at home, carbon is an element that you should be looking at. Threats to soils. I've talked a lot about this, but erosion, and this is happening because of humans, this is happening because of nature, this is happening because of the cycles that happen in our climate, but erosion and contamination are a huge component of that. There's about 1.7 billion acres, I'll use acres, even though I'm Canadian and I speak in hectares, I flip back and forth. As a good farmer, I use every metric, so but I'll go with acres because that's the actual stat. There's 1.7 billion acres of topsoil that is eroded every year in North America. That's staggering amount of topsoil. And for those that are in agriculture or do any growing, food security, or interested in plants, it's typically the top 2 inches of soil that we grow in and we interact with in terms of our crops that we eat. And so if we're eroding that much topsoil, we're starting getting down, planting into soil that isn't as accommodating to the structures, and hence we have to have a lot more human involvement with some of the inputs in there. So eradicating some of the erosion by planting cover crops, by green manure, by doing other ecologically sound designs that are going to be helping us regenerate the soils. It's going to help reduce the erosion, and soil can rebound. We can regrow. It can come back. So the erosion that's happened will take a long time, but we can help the soil start to regenerate and replenish itself. The other threats, sealing, compaction, urban centers are a huge part of this. We think about earthworks where you see the jackhammers compacting the soil. Compaction happens in a lot of different ways, but it basically kills out a lot of the positive microorganism communities that are happening below the soil, water retention, and a lot of the positive things that we need to see happen. So compaction is certainly a negative force that we need to try to counteract in ways that we can. There's a lot of great building science and architecture that is trying to work a lot more closely with soils to eradicate some of that compaction, and at least try to embrace some of the things that we're talking about in regenerating our soils and what's happening below our feet. Lots of biodiversity. If you work with me and have worked with me in the past or have interacted with me, biodiversity for me is essential. And whether that is a plant structure, whether we're growing, whether we're putting renewable energies on our soils, whether we're building buildings, whether it's thinking about communities, biodiversity is huge. And I think it's something that we need to be talking more readily about, but certainly below the soil, creating biodiverse communities of microorganisms, fungi, nematodes, nutrient exchanges, cation exchanges. We need more of that, and I'm getting a little bit into the science of soil, but more biodiversity in the soil is going to equal better outcomes in all aspects. It's understanding what type of soil we're working with to start, to understand what kind of biodiversity we can help support to regenerate. Salinization is something that we're counteracting and working against. The sun is having a huge effect of that. Salt pockets, salinity pockets that are happening within the soils that are killing out those bio-beneficial communities below the soil. But it's something that we need to be thinking about and observing. Some of it is a little bit environmental, some of it is natural in terms of cycles that happen, but salinization is something that we certainly need to be thinking about as a threat to our soil systems, which does lead to a lot more floods, a lot more landslides. As we build below sea grade, below river grade, below lake grade, we're going to be thinking about floods and landslides on a greater basis. As we're building into mountainsides, as we're building into island sides, floods happen a lot, and erosion is something that in design we don't spend a lot of time modeling out. And so when we're thinking about designing our ecosystems, whether we're living there, whether it's an agroforestation, replantation, whatever that may look like, erosion modeling is something that would help us counteract some of the floods that are bound to happen, but also understanding where we're building our ecosystems that we're going to be interacting with. There's a project that I'm working out in Minnesota, in the USA, and it's in one of the northern states in the southern region, but there was an idea to build a community within a floodplain, what was a floodplain. And, as we took a look at some of the historical modeling of that area, the soil is lush, the soil is wonderful. It's got all those riverways, and it really hasn't been worked very well. Got a lot of lush greenness. One thing I noted is that a floodplain is bound to flood at some point. So we really need to be thinking about, the longevity of building a community within that area, as opposed to building maybe up on the shorelines and then think about the erosion fact to model that out. So floodplains, if we know anything from history, flood at some point, maybe not in our lifetime, but we're hoping to build sustainable ecosystems far beyond us. So thinking about understanding where flood plains are and how they interact with what we're trying to do with them. So soil does develop over time from the parent material that is moved through to the young soil structure, to the mature soil structure, to the old soil structure. It does have this evolution that happens. And like everything in our nature, it's very dynamic, and they can change faster over time, depending on what we're putting into it, and in more nature-based climates, and depending what kind of phytology, so the plants, the tree structure, the agroforestry that goes along with the plant structure, phytology as a whole, would dictate to, the speed of which the soils are developing over time. Again, we're planting typically when we're interacting with soil from an agriculture standpoint. It's the top 2 inches of soil really that we're playing around with, but we need to be thinking much deeper than that. When we're thinking about carbon as a whole, and I've had some experience building non-soil disturbant carbon scanning machines. Carbon is measured typically in the top 30 centimeters, but we're going all the way down to a meter now, really trying to understand the what I call it, the fossilized, but the historic elements of that old soil that's starting to bubble up. So as we erode the soil from the top, that old soil is starting to bubble up a little bit and gain oxidization and starting to interact. And so the carbon dioxide that we're pulling down is sequestration, and the fossilized carbon that's being held down there is starting to mix in the middle. And so we need to be able to understand soil at a much deeper level. But that top 30 centimeters, the top 2 inches that we're concerned about in terms of growing is very, very important for us to understand the maturity of soil. Aging basically is what we're getting at. The image here, if you can see my mouse on the far right-hand side of that image, is really what we're thinking about as a regeneration image. And so we're kind of playing with a model that looks a little more like this on the left-hand side. And as we start to regenerate soil, we'll start to see those top layers, that maturity, the parent and the young soils come back to life and have a lot more to play with, where we're not interacting as much with mature soils or the old soils that we're unfortunately getting down and interacting with too much nowadays. Apologize for flipping too fast there. So just another sort of example of understanding the age of soils. We hear the different terms: topsoil, subsoil, and parental soil, parent material. These are just the different distinct layers that happen within soils. And in fact, if any of you on the call are have any soil background, you might hear soil horizons. And soil horizons are really how soil scientists or agronomists or those that are very much involved in understanding soil in different ways talk about soil. So O horizon, which is the organic layer, it sits on the top, or A horizon, which is the topsoil. So you see the note here of topsoil. The E horizon is the elevation layer that happens just below the topsoil. So it's the E horizon. And then we get into the subsoil, which is the B horizon. So often we talk about topsoil and subsoil, and we'll forget about the E horizon that sort of sits in this evolution of soil dynamicy and soil growth as it happens. And that E horizon is something that is very important to the mineral and organic matter decomposition. So if you take another takeaway from this, it's thinking about the O, A, and E horizon before you get to the subsoil. And that E horizon is very important to that mineral and organic matter decomposition. So another note to write down if you're taking any notes. When we think about soil profiles, and the reason I put this here is depending on where you're located in the world, I look at my friends in Australia that have a lot of red soils. There's at least one person on the call here that I know has done some work or interacted with the Middle East that has redder soils. And I was just over there in April, and different soil types, but certainly I wanted to talk about some soil profiles as it relates to some of those pieces that I just mentioned in terms of aging and dynamicity. So dark topsoil is kind of what we're looking for in North America, as sort of a functional soil health visual indication. When we see dark soils within your plants in your home, or maybe a controlled environment agriculture, typically is infused with a lot of other particles in there, some white dots. And these are sort of man-made injections of what dark soil is. But dark soil outdoors in situ are kind of a good visual state of that parental state of regeneration of soils and what we're wanting to see happen. The red subsoil type is a result of weathering and that fun word that we hear, oxidization. You see oxidization happen a lot with fruits. If you expose them, banana is a big one, avocado is a big one. You peel it or you cut it open, and once you see that oxidization happen, you see something of that coloration change. It doesn't mean that they're bad. it just means oxidization is happening. And so when we get into that subsoil, that red subsoil visual component, visualization, you can understand that a little bit of that is to weathering, because we're interacting with that layer, we may have eroded too much, in oxidization. Of course, oxidization is a key indicator that we haven't done enough regeneration on that top section of soil. And then the complex soil horizons that happen below that. And by the way, there's certainly layers below the O horizon. We get into the C horizon and the R horizon in terms of some of that complex soil types that happen below subsoil there. And those are unweathered bedrock that is starting to break down and create some soil formation. And the C horizon has components of consistent decomposition components, but structure and texture of the mineral content is really what is visually present when you look at soils. One thing I will note here, and this is just a basic one, for anyone that has got a backyard garden that is working with an outdoor soil type, I still fundamentally believe in taking a shovel, planting it in the dirt, picking up, seeing how many earthworms are in there, and smelling it. Good soil, good, healthy, functional soil should smell. It has a vibrance of it, and it's going to smell different depending on the bioregions that you're in, but by and large, it smells decent. Soil that doesn't smell is an indicator that probably there's something going on. But the other visual in there is the number of earthworms that you see within the soil and the porousness of the holes that you see within the soil. So the visualization in the hands and dirt, and I talk about that with my team. I've talked about that for years, interacting on different projects, land and earthworks and agriculture projects. Very much hand and dirt, smelling, feeling, and observing are still some of the key takeaways in really interacting and understanding what we need to do with the soils that we rely on so heavily. There's wonderful technology out there, both remote sensing, scanning, that are aiding us in our understanding of soils and sort of soil science components from analysis. There's many different analysis types, but that hands and soil and the visual and smell test, I highly encourage you, if you haven't done it, get out there and start playing around with soil types. This can be done at home too, even with your potted plants, grabbing a few, giving it some indication. You know, if it feels really moist and a little bit waterlogged, it's going to be a key indicator. If you can make a ball out of it and it doesn't break down quickly, it's another visual sign that potentially you're overwatering or it needs a little bit of shoring up. You know, the root structures, as you place your hand in there, be careful not to break them, but they can get matted in the potted soils as well. So thinking about soil and a lot of different elements. Influences soils, of course, us as humans are the biggest influence, but living influences on the organisms that are in the air, and airborne bacteria, airborne fungi that happen to fall onto our soil canopies from everything that we do as humans, and as nature produces rain clouds and brings in all the particles that lands on our soil canopy and has an influence on the soil. Vegetation and how vegetation interacts with the soil, whether planted on purpose or whether nature-based grasses or flora fauna in phytology in general, has a way of shaping soils and how it interacts with the environment around it, the ecosystem around it. The topography, I talked about those floodplains, so understanding the topography, your mountain ranges, your rolling hill types, and all the different elements that we think about from a urban planning or even from a regenerative landscape planning mindset. Permaculture comes into this a lot in terms of how we think about the topography of the land. That's going to have a large effect on how soils are created or how soils develop and age over time. I talked about soil being a great highway for the exchange of the nutrients. Of course, the higher you go on topography, just like everything runs downhill, and so you're going to get the higher concentration of all those minerals in the lower laying pieces versus the higher line. But there's still the same exchange and the same need in the higher regions to think about the nutrients and the water and the bacteria and the fungi that are involved up there. In case in point, organic matter helps grow. I was working on a project actually where they put crushed rock, they put landscape fabric down, and crushed rock up to their new dwelling, their new house. And they thought it would be fairly maintenance free, and they were surprised to find out that they were getting plants growing on this crushed rock. And I said, well, of course, you get topsoil blowing in, you get a little bit of water, and you get organic matter, which was crushed rock, and you create a recipe for thriving plants. You see this on the side of mountains. You're like, I can't believe the trees growing up in the middle of this rock structure here. Again, rock is just an organic matter. You have a little bit of floating bacteria, topsoil in the air, and a little bit of moisture, and you're going to get a recipe for the opportunity for plants and flora fauna to grow. So, we can really understand that the influences of soil on everything and every piece of our ecosystem is very, very prominent to us. And it doesn't take a whole lot for soils to start growing things that we want or things that we may not want. But again, it's an indication of probably what's going on in the soil, not necessarily that we don't need it. From an agriculture standpoint, on my own farm, I have a big problem with what we call Russian thistle or Canadian thistle. And there's a lot of people that try to knock that out with different inputs, whether nature-based or chemical-based. But really, it's just an indication of a lack of potassium in the soil. And then when you get into the understanding of the periodic table or nutrients going on, you can start to use different methods of planting a biodiverse crop to start to choke out some of the undesirable plant structures in there. But it was a key indicator for me on my lack of attention to what was going on in the soils on my own farm. Climate, I want us to understand that moisture and temperature are probably the two biggest components of climate to the soils. How much and when, so too much can be problematic, not enough can be problematic. It's always this fine line and balance. And temperatures. There's one of our team members actually is over in Asia, and he was mentioning to me that it's been the longest and hottest period that Korea has ever seen in terms of nighttime lows in the 27, 28 Celsius and highs, reaching far higher than they would like to see this time of year, and that's been consistent. So even in Canada and down into the US, where I've been doing a lot of work on the eastern seaboard, we're seeing higher than normal temperatures. On the eastern seaboard, we're seeing a lot more moisture, so almost too much moisture. So the environment has a big play in how soils are going to function and how we interact with that. And for me, it's really around understanding the soil canopy and what we need to do to help it in terms of all these conditions. So the more we cover our soils, the more it helps cool the climate around us, and the more that we regenerate the soils, the better off it will be in holding water. So we reduce some of those flash floods and some of the negative components of this moisture and temperature climate effect. The other things I want you to pay attention to really quickly in terms of particle sizes when we think about soil and the influences of putting your hands into the soil and what you're looking at. There are smaller particle sizes that certainly hold water and nutrients, and there's larger, coarser particle sizes that are going to promote more oxidization. I put Arizona down there because Arizona is a very hot climate. You actually see a lot of that. Arizona's in the US for some of our international community members on this call here. And just to state that if you look into some of the red soil profiles or some of that oxidization soil profiles, you're going to see larger particle sizes that are going to be exposed more readily to the elements, as it were, versus the northern climate soil types, which are going to be a little more packed. And it's a little bit similar to what I indicated in terms of our veins on our arm. Those in hotter climates, the veins are closer to the surface, they respire a little bit more, they're going to be more prone to the elements. In colder climates, they actually, on the human body, and they go inwards, they're a little more insulated and a little bit smaller and not as prone to the elements. And the reason I correlate to the human body, and my wife works in the medical field, and what I do in the soil and the environment has a close correlation. Funnily enough, we often talk about the similarities to the human body and what's happening in the soil dynamics that we play around with. But just thinking about the influences of where we're located in the bioregion is really what I wanted to talk about in this particle size here. And as we think about all of that information and our understanding of soils, one of the things that I really want to promote and champion, for those that haven't, the simple soil test, going out with a shovel. But I would highly encourage it. The simple ones you can get on Amazon: soil testing, understanding the pH level, which is something I didn't get into, but there is a just like the pH balance in a lot of things. There's sort of that sweet zone of acidic and that alkaline, and that sweet zone of the pH balance. You can have things that like to grow in more alkaline or more acidic soil types. So understanding what you're trying to put in there for planting, but by and large, understanding the pH level of your soil, but your soil types is something that I would highly recommend. There's a lot of great services out there as well for those that are maybe taking that next step into understanding the intermediate level of soil knowledge. So using a soil lab that is not you could use a dry combustion lab if you want. But sending away a composite in a brown bag to a soil lab that is going to analyze the soil and provide you some feedback. And some soil, the lab I like to use in North America is called Regen Ag Labs. I'm not promoting them, but they just have if you look at their website, there's many other labs that break down a lot of the different elements of what we should be analyzing for. But temperature, total compensation, total carbon, total organic carbon, which is inorganic and organic matter in the soil, is something that I think you should be paying attention to as you understand your own soils on your own property, as well as the what we call the nitrogen cycle, or it's really just an understanding of how plants and soils hold nitrate in the soil. And the more nitrate is held in the soil, when the plants feed on it naturally, nitrogen being a key component for plant growth and stimulation, the better off we're going to be in growing healthy plants. And we don't have to pour on synthetic nitrogen or even other forms of nitrogen. If we can figure out the nitrogen balance or the nitrogen cycle, we'll be better off for it in some of that soil. So I highly promote doing some sort of soil test just to get a baseline of understanding of where you are in your soil types before you start digging and planting and adding anything to it. There are a lot of different cycles that happen within the soil: the carbon cycle I mentioned, the mineral cycle, the nitrogen cycle. A lot of it can feel like which one do I need to pay attention to? For me, it's simplifying it, understanding what soil type you have, what components are there currently, and then you can quickly diagnose based on what you want to do with it, what we need to have happen. And by the way, compaction for earthworks for the purpose of building ponds or irrigation systems is okay in the larger design element, so multi-purpose uses. The soil that we pull out in terms of the earthwork and repurpose in other places, maybe it's adding to our compost pile, maybe it's creating a culture pile in our shores or riverbeds or even on our flatland to promote growth of different plant species. That's all valuable soil to you, so repurpose any soil in the earthworks, but we understand we need to interact with soil to live on it or put out buildings as much as we are trying to promote the regeneration. And then interaction with agroforestry. So there's a great predominance for greens, so native grasses and greening, but let's not forget about the planting of trees, which is another level or step up in terms of the carbon sequestration, that long-term nutrient cycling that happens that only forestry components can give us. That's a little bit above the other plants and flora fauna that we interact with. Anyway, I think I've rambled on a little bit. I've probably confused a little bit, which I hope I provided a little bit of knowledge here, but I'm really interested to try to answer some of these questions that you may have in the box there. And I thank you for giving me a few moments of your time on this Lunch and Learn. And the takeaway there: functional soil health and making sure you do soil sampling. So those are the two major takeaways that I'd like to leave you with. Let's see.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Neil. Yeah, we do have several questions in the chat box. If you want, I could just start rattling some of these off for you. And of course, anybody, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Neil any questions you might have. But in the meantime, we'll go with the first question here, which is from Gardner. Gardner asks, what's the best, easiest way to test soil health for a person who is relatively new to all of this?
Wonderful. I would simply do one of those DIY soil sampling kits. You can buy them off Amazon. You can usually, if you Google it, I know in Canada we have a few different labs, ANL Labs that sells really simple DIY soil sampling kits. It's a step-by-step, fairly cost-effective, gives you enough indication. And then don't forget about that hand in soil, shovel in soil test as well, and then do some Googling or reach out to me if you have any questions via the community here. And happy to answer those questions. But that would be the easiest way and quickest way to sort of get introduced to some of that soil knowledge and soil analysis. I see, Lana, you put a question on there about wildfire effects. So this is a great question. And so there's something that happens in nature when wildfires happen. It's almost a natural pyrolysis process that happens, and it creates a char, a biochar. And biochar is actually a great way to amend soils. We do have to be careful with biochar in terms of man-made biochar. I mean, there's a lot of positives and there's research to promote that, but there's also some negative in terms of where we source the materials for biochar and the harmful contaminants that go into char sometimes and being added on. So heavy metals, toxic compounds that I talked about. So if you're sourcing biochar from a pyrolysis, which is a non-nature-based charring process, just be aware of that. But by and large, wildfire effects do have both a positive and a negative effect on soils. Initially, they're going to probably be a negative, and they're going to correlate with potential floods that come after a forest fire. That topsoil is probably not going to be rooted. But if it's a fire, and as long as it's not being doused with too many chemicals or close to human habitat to serve a natural wildfire, that regeneration of the soils will actually happen quite quickly. You'll start to see a lot of regrowth. It's a natural cycle that happens in our environment. And if you go into a wildfire after the fire, of course, be safe, please, and you dig your hands in the soils. And you can even see this in fire pit. You take some of that soot, and you can actually put soot into your plants. There's a lot of nutrients that are in there that are baked into that pyrolysis, that natural pyrolysis process. I apologize about that noise, but you'll hear it. So I highly encourage you to think about it as more of a positive. It does slow down some of the regeneration depending on the bioregion that you're in. Does that help answer that question?
Sorry, just getting a little bit of feedback from the microphone. I don't know if it's on my end only or where it might be, but it looks like they may have answered the question there. John also had a question for you in regards to double check, make sure I got this correct. Since soil regeneration must be much slower process than many forms of erosion, he asks, I'm wondering whether you have statistics on how much regeneration is taking place in North America versus the 1 billion acres eroding each year that was mentioned earlier.
That's a really good question. I don't have that information at my fingertips. I know there is information out there around that. Really good sources, Understanding Ag or some of the regeneration organizations that are out there statistically. Just 1 second, right? I'm just going to try to cut down this noise for 1 second. I'll be.
Yep, no worries. In the meantime, just want to remind everybody that You feel free to unmute yourselves and ask Neil any questions that you might have. He's super eager, super keen to take on any questions that may have arose from this sort of introductory to functional soil health.
I'm gonna raise my hand, Neil. My name is Donnie Lewis. It's up there. I do have a question. I saw something recently about the frequencies in soil health and being able to measure it, the vibration of the soil health. Have you looked into that at all? Because I was thinking about it in the way that we would be able to utilize it as an automated system and know exactly what is missing from the soil and what we could then put together to be able to add what is necessary or what is missing, what's not showing up in those waves, depending on the bioregion that the soil is being sampled in.
That's a great question, Donnie. He did step away for just a moment to adjust his microphone connection issues. It sounded like he was getting a little bit of feedback and background noise. But yeah, it's a really great question. Also, great to see you here joining us today, Donnie.
Yeah,
Oh,
Johnny, if you could just repeat that really quickly. I apologize. My neighbors started drilling. So I just asked them to stop. Of course, it never fails. It happens during a webinar, but we live in a life of remote conversations these days. So
absolutely.
anyway, I'd love to hear that again.
Used to
Yeah.
or dogs barking in the background, or birds tweeting, crickets chirping. There's always something. My question was about the frequencies and measuring the soil health with frequency measurements. Have you looked into that at all? Because I was thinking about it being able to use it as an automated system for soil health, tapping it into a database that could then tell you what it is that's needed in that bioregion and what you could grow, what you could change, what needs to be added, what is missing for that soil's optimal health.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I personally haven't been involved in any studies or interacted, but I know there is a lot of work being done on echo sound within the soils. There's actually soil sound therapy out there that for humans, they go to resorts or retreats, and they actually plug in devices into the soil, and that is part of the therapeutic process session that they go through. But as it relates to your question, there's some groups, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but they're connected with the National Soil Dynamic Lab and the USDA in the States that is working specifically on that, actually, Donnie, around taking frequencies from the soil and understanding how we can plug that into mapping ongoing effects, or trying to model out what's happening in terms of the pH ranges, nutrient level changes that are happening, and what needs to take place in terms of a creation of almost like a histogram that is going to help us do some modeling basically for regeneration. So certainly I can get some information, plug it into our VDAO community as a follow-up to this conversation, if that helps.
That would be awesome. Thank you very much for that. I would really appreciate that.
Yeah.
And thanks for the very informative, lovely presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. And I think, Lana, you had a sort of a two-part question there. I only kind of skimmed it as I was going across, but happy to follow up on biome and real-life stories as well, as it relates to some regeneration in forest or coastal systems that tend to be a little bit different than agricultural plains or Great Plain systems that I'm primarily have been talking about in this. Great. John, I think you had a question there. It says, since soil regeneration must be slower. Oh, that's right. I did answer this. I don't have the stats on the number, but there is certainly a growing number of acres that are regenerating or in the process. I think probably my quickest response to that would be, I don't think there's enough, whether non-agriculture or agriculture data out there to really understand how many acres have fully regenerated, but the number that are moving into regeneration processes, I think, is something that can be calculated. And there's, through the USDA, the Canadian Soil Science Association, as well as many other regen outfits throughout the global system. I think there's some data out there that we could accumulate quite quickly, but I typically go to the Canadian Soil Association, and then the USDA National Soil Dynamic Lab tends to have a lot of data around the processes, and they're just big data houses that gather a lot of information and analyze that.
Great, thank you. Maybe just a quick follow-up. I wonder if, I imagine there are probably regions or local areas that have gotten to kind of a tipping point where it's not feasible or just like too expensive. There's so much, erosion, and so are we seeing that in various parts of the world? Unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately, Australia tends to be an early adopter to some of those negative, just because of the harsh climates over there and a lot of the agricultural components that have led them there, but also the demand on the land. And they're one of the first to adopt some of the climate and carbon components to help sort of mitigate some of that erosion that's happening and the negative effects. We're starting to see that in different areas within North America. The prairies of Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba are starting to see a lot more of the negative come up. Through the wheat belt, the Midwest section of America, you're starting to see that. But I'm also seeing this in pockets on the coast in California, where they're having a lot of water restrictions now. And it's almost a rebound effect that's happening, right? And so you're starting to see a negative before they start to see a regeneration process happen, because they're cutting off one of the key elements, which is water. And now they're looking for nature to help replenish that, and they're trying to plant enough trees and create these micro environments that are going to create some different water management processes. The other areas that I'm seeing that in are in the Georgia, Tennessee area in America. We're starting to see a depletion and sort of a tipping point happen, a large part due to sort of conventional. And I don't like to use the word conventional because I'm a big proponent to say we can't forget about the science that got us here. We can only improve on it. And conventional is a mechanism of just standard processes. But the standard process that has led us to some of this tipping point now needs to be thought about differently. And so in parts of Brazil, where there's been mass deforestation for agricultural purposes, we're certainly seeing a lot of that as well. The benefit there is that the environment, the bioregion, can replenish a little bit faster than maybe some of our northern climates, just because of the moisture and heat and those two key components to the soil, moisture and temperature. So though there's a tipping point, that's certainly, we're well past the tipping point. I think there's a faster rebound that's going to happen in those areas. Right on. Great questions, by the way. Lana, I also recommend, there's a few people on our within the VDAO community here that have some great academic experience around biochar. I think one of them is still on call with us, Sui. You may want to reach out and explore some conversation and research there too. I know they've got some deep background on that, and certainly I value their research on that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. The biochar concept is really wide. Like, it's a very big thing. Joking historically, it has been used long time ago, randomly by the Brazilians in the Amazons, and it's like they discovered it lately, and they just show the influence of the biochar on the soil, and they noticed it not a long time ago, to be honest. And as researchers, we start working on it. So it's pretty tricky, because you got to take care of the feedstock. Whatever you put in the feedstock, you're gonna get as a final product. So there are so many concerns on sewage water, like sewage and sludge, and even the plants that are near the where you keep your sewage and sludge. So you gotta take care of it. You gotta make risk assessment before you make your biochar for the feedstock, because okay, you wanna influence your soil and make better soil, but at the same time you don't want heavy metals in your soil, you know. So during my research here in my PhD, I worked in biochar. I made like risk assessment and all of that, and I considered some biomass from the forest, so it's pretty natural, and there's no amendments or there's no any other attract, let's say, heavy metals, because it's in the nature, you know, they don't add anything in there. So we took all of that feedstock and we pyrolyzed it in a proper way, and even pyrolyzing it, it should be like, you know, nowadays biochar is a big industry and so many companies are using it as a carbon credit. And I mean, just for like carbon, like CO2 mitigation, and it doesn't make sense when you burn the feedstock to release CO2 and other gases. So it would be like, okay, I'll mitigate CO2, but okay, I'll release another CO2. So you sell carbon credit and release it. So it doesn't make sense. But there's a solution for this. And there's like I think that the godfather of the biochar is from America. He's Dr. Lemon. He's very famous professor. And there's a technique of it, and I use the same technique like that. You basically leave the old gases. I mean, before everything, there's like a lack of oxygen, so there's not that much of CO2 if you're doing it properly, you know. But even though all of that gases and emissions, you send it to somewhere with oil, so you can use even the oil after all, and use it for like it's to produce energy basically, or do something else with it. And there is like some other liquid that comes out, which is very, very good for the soil health as well. So the main product would be biochar, but you would get two other like sub products, let's say. So the influence of
it'd be helpful maybe, Subi, if you had any links to send into the VDAO community on some of that knowledge or history, that might be worth sharing.
Sorry, come again?
I was just saying if you had any links or any research that you could share within the DAO community on one of the chat groups, that might be useful too for those on the call here to read into it.
Oh yeah, I can just put some links for biochar and how it works, what is the impact of it, how it works in the soil, why it's important for the soil. I'll do that. I'll just okay.
Yeah, thank you, Subi. Really appreciate that. Yeah.
Maybe as a follow-up to Donnie's question about getting feedback from soil, what are maybe a couple of really good natural feedback loops that exist as indicators of soil health, and maybe what are some more modernized pieces of equipment or sort of MRV that can be used to really dig into figuring out like what is the current state of soil in a particular location.
Yeah, so really good question, by the way. I think the natural or visual observations, I talked about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is really just iron and magnesium, which are essential for that greening effect. So if you see you're getting different colors other than green, really often leads to an iron or magnesium depletion. So you can look into some of the say the periodic table of elements and how it's interacting with your plants. Micronutrients such as zinc, copper, are regulate the plant metabolic state. So if you're seeing that there's different growth rates happening on some of your plants versus others, it might just be, again, a factor of magnesium, but copper or zinc that might play in there. So visual observations, there are some tests you can do for that. Again, you can order simple ones off Amazon to do some of the nutrient testing. One of the ones that I don't think gets talked about enough, but it's boron. Boron being a vital component of how the flowers formed on plants indoors. So if you're seeing some of your plants are just blooming wonderfully and you're watering it, and then others are really struggling, it may just be that there's a depletion of boron. And there's natural ways to increase that, eggshells or banana peel plants. And I highly recommend Googling some of these repurposed components of the organic things that we're eating that you can liquefy and put on your home plants to deal with some of the visual observations you're seeing and changes there. Disease resistance. One of the things I really like for outdoor market garden, backyard garden, where you're getting a lot of mites and pests, I go to vinegar. It's my go-to. I spray it in a 3-to-1 ratio on my leaves, like a foliar. Acts as a little bit of a sunblock as well. The other thing, if you really want to take that up a notch, look at vermiculture. So worm poop. You can liquefy worm poop. It's a wonderful foliar spray. Again, it acts as a bit of a sunblock on outdoor plants when it's really, really hot. But the disease resistance because of it is wonderful. You can also put it on raw form or non-liquid form around the base of the plants, or mix. The best is to mix it into the soil, not just put it on top. And it will really help promote the plant structure there. So take a look at both of those components. As it relates to MRV, there's some really simple MRVs in there out there. Typically, a lot of them are going to be subscription based, to my knowledge base. But there's one out of Australia. I don't like to promote too many companies, but Hone, just as a H-O-N-E, if you want to do some Googling there. There's a great company in North America called Merge Impact that's got various different MRV models. There's a great European one that's very remote sensing MRV, which is called Digiland. They're based out of Norway. Digimaps, sorry. But in general, when you're talking about monitoring and verification, and if you're really looking into MRV, it's the level of rigor that the data is producing. So NDVI, which is the change of vegetation over time, where that data is coming from and how it's getting analyzed is usually the question I ask. So it's the rigor of the data that's really going to give you some key takeaways. So be thinking about that. If you are thinking about carbon market space, really just understand, I say this not to knock it by any means, I've got my own views on it, but really understand what your contractual requirements are. At the end of the day, I promote carbon dioxide being stored into the ground and how we get there and how we can monetize that. But if you're getting into a contract, just understand that there's a lot of places to go and talk and things that we can do. And then I think, the in between the MRV in terms of a monetized opportunity for you and just understanding, the elements. There's simple things like the bricks testing in terms of understanding the nutrient density levels within your plants, especially if you're going to consume them, and really doing a good farm planning. And I talk about farm planning for your own backyard. What are you putting down, understanding what your base level is when you started, monitoring that over time, and you'll start to see good analysis and indications. And there's some great, Small Farm is it's a great online platform. There's a few other ones out there as well. Again, subscription service that you plug in a bunch of data, it provides you some recommendations, but it also gives you some great feedback as an electronic form to do some farm planning. But Excel works just as good, and I did that for a number of years. I try to get out of a notebook, try to get something a little more electronic because you can do a lot more with it in terms of historical and current day analysis. But there's a lot of great tools. Just take a note though of the plant changes and what's happening. How many leaves are falling off the plant versus the neighboring plant might give you an indication of what's going on in the soil down below on the reproductive health. Typically, it's going to be a micronutrient. Far too often we go to the macronutrients, so the NPK, as a lot of us you'll see. But the micronutrients are really what are going to impact the pH levels, that chlorophyll, that enzymatic function, the nutrient utilization, and they don't get enough talk, but certainly they're very, very important. One of those micronutrients, molybdenum, some of you may have heard of it, is very, very important actually to that nitrogen cycle, the nitrate cycle that I talked about. It helps capture nitrogen in the ground to be utilized as needed as plants grow, as opposed to an induction of synthetic or other nitrogen-based amendments we put on.
Now, I know we've kind of been a bit more focused on some of the more micro solutions. Would you be able to maybe share your insights on some of the things that we could do, maybe not as individuals, but like what are some of the solutions maybe for a more macro solution for fixing or regenerating soils at large scale?
Yeah. Well, really, this is where I play. So that was a wonderful question. The designing of regenerative systems involves reduction all the way up to zero-till cropping, cover crops. And cover crops can be used in your backyard. It can be used in the bed. And there's a lot of, my view on cover crops, it should be multi-species. Multi-species can help with really understanding all the different microorganisms that are happening down below, the different root structures, release different sugars and different elements that the microorganisms feed off of. If you're looking to utilize or reduce the compaction level, if you've had a lot of trucks driving over your land, or it was once a construction site that you've now got a backyard garden on, daikon radishes mixed with a bunch of other legumes and are a great tap root structure to break up that compaction and allow a bit of variation. So look at cover crops, small or large. I wouldn't till even your backyard beds. I mean, I certainly wouldn't till any agriculture. So those rototills and the tilling, get away from. Covering your soils. If you're in the northern climate, I like to cover with hay or straw. I use third cut alfalfa just for some of the protein levels. Cover your beds, cover your raised garden beds. You're not going to do that on broad acre, of course, but on the market garden and even in your orchard rows. So those are some of the sort of fundamentals. Crop rotations, really understand rotation of crops. Don't try to plant the same thing all the time. Get it biodiverse. You can do champion crops. So as one crop grows and you harvest, another crop comes in. And then use pollination, nature pollination sources. I like alfalfa bees, leaf cutter bees. I call them alfalfa bee cutters, but leaf cutter bees as a pollination source are wonderful pollinators. But flowers, pollinating flowers that are planted with your different fruits and veggies and legumes, even in the orchard, are terrific. Really start looking for integration of livestock, small and large. I love the springtime when all the spiders come out, because that indicates to me there's enough bug insect flying around that you're getting that cross contamination, pollination, and all the positive things that are happening. But chickens, goats, if you can get into a flurd, if you can get some of that natural flurd being a mixture of different livestock, that's great. But if it's just chickens or it's just small ruminants, integration of livestock is wonderful, and I think we all need to be looking at that. And then water capturing systems, and whether that is catch basins, swales, rainwater harvest systems off your roof. The best form of irrigation is rainwater. The best form of water in soils is rainwater. So the more we can capture it and utilize it and repurpose it, the better off we're going to be. So definitely think about that. You can help along. One of the neat things you can do with vermiculture is create a little bit of a tea, but do it sparingly. anything that's overdone tends to have an adverse effect. So, keep it simple. Agroforestation integrated with our growing system. So even in your own backyard, planting a few trees. Check your regulations around what you can plant and can't plant for disease purposes, but by and large, creating some canopy shelter and getting that root structure into the ground from those forestry projects and trees is going to be very beneficial. And there's a huge variety. One of our team members is Fifth World, is a phytology specialist, so you can certainly reach out to Adrian if you have any questions around that. He loves to talk about the integration of trees in our growing systems, small or large. Carbon sequestration, think about the things that we can do to bring carbon dioxide into the ground. And there's numerous different ways, and biochar being one of them. But definitely there's perennial pastures and numerous other mitigation components that can help us sequester carbon. By all means, please try to stay away from synthetics as it relates to inputs. Nature-based, there's some great science, biostimulants out there, aqua inputs, utilization of kelp. If you haven't thought about the different kelp types that are out there that are being used in liquid forms, do look at that. The Atlantic kelp versus the southern kelp, like coming from South Africa, they have different organism and traits that can be used. Those are nature-based inputs that are non-synthetic and are processed very well. And then anything we can do to help enhance land restoration. So understanding what the historical purpose of that land was prior to us being there. Sometimes there's natural rivers or natural swales or aquifers that we can help replenish, and even just wetlands that we have covered over with soil or maybe prominent. Adding ponds, ducks are another great introduction to livestock. And then there's numerous different programs depending on where you're located that I think we should all pay attention to. I'm not advocating that you have to go to subsidization, but I think the programs from a conservation or ecological standpoint that are helping promote the regeneration of our ecosystems are wonderful. Reintroduction of beavers into riverways in a township or in a riverway. So working with those groups, conservation and ecologically sound groups that have some capital to help you and your ecosystem are certain things that I think we should be exploring more readily in our township and even in our feed out community here as we continue to talk about the different regions we live in.
Yeah, I think you touched on a great point there, Neil, about the potential for different things like grants and different programs that will actually go out and support individuals who are doing this kind of work, or looking to create a project that will regenerate a piece of land. I know that's something in VDAO that we're definitely looking at consistently, trying to figure out different ways to go about purchasing land, and then going and regenerating that land, through the use of permaculture and other aspects. So it's very, very interesting stuff. Again, if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to jump in and ask Neil any questions you might have. Otherwise, if those are all the questions that we have currently, or John, it looks like you might be.
Yeah, I had another one. Thanks again, Neil. This is super helpful. On the side you had on the pedagogic approach, you made a point about organic. I think it was something about like if you're putting like maybe it's packaged quote unquote organic material into a garden bed like mine or something, thinking about like what exactly is in there. Was it in contrast to like truly organic or like compost you might make yourself?
Yeah, I mean, compost you make yourself. I'm a big fan of compost. When we think about creating compost systems, I always want to think about the source of where we bring in our organic matter. So if you're buying a lot of product at any of the top CPGs, which consumer product goods stores, I'm not going to name any, knowing where those products came from is very important, because of, we may think it's organic, we may think it's, doesn't have any of the negative chemicals on it, but it may actually, and so those go into our compost bin, and you may actually see your compost sprouting different funguses or bacteria because of these elements in there. And so I always want everyone to be very careful as we think about building our own compost with our own organic matter that we buy from the stores. If it's coming off of our farm or from our backyard or from sources that we know, then that's one thing. The other thing is how do we define organic matter? And I think there's, organic matter can be broken down. Cardboard that we know that was locally sourced, or fiberboard, or coconut core is organic matter as well. And so we can think about organic in different ways. If you're feeding worms, it's probably going to be less. So a worm is actually, it's got a gizzard, it's a shredder. And so it shreds material. So if you're putting those organic waste from fruits, legumes, vegetables from the CPG store of choice, they're going to digest and process it differently. And so the more worms you add to it, the less worried you have to be. But if it's just a natural decomposition method, do think about the heavy metals or chemistry that might be in there that isn't as healthy as you start reapplying that back on your soils. The key visual indicator is typically the funguses and white mycelium that grows on the top. You'll see white fungus, you'll see maybe blue or gray. You're going to see the visual things that potentially you go, I wonder if that's beneficial or negative. And typically people work that into the soils to be decomposed. I would say try to add some sort of worm structure or vermiculture in there to help really knock that out and make sure you don't have any problems. People can get quite sick from compost if they're not aware. So from a human health standpoint, that's what I'm trying to avoid. From a soil health component, adding the wrong things in the ground means we're going to have to amend the ground, right? And so if we've created this great compost and we're adding it in and that actually has a negative effect, then you're going to have to create some sort of amendment to help counteract that, which what we're trying to do is promote soil health with the compost. So just think about it. There's a lot of great resources online about how to process and inoculate your own compost. Eco teas are a great one. I tend to go to vermiculture and eco teas because they tend to do things very quickly and they're very accessible to the everyday grower. And then, I don't be afraid for some of the backyard growers to, take a look at some of the great natural-based products that are out there in terms of, call it a fertilizer because that's what it's named in the stores, starter. But just understand where it comes from. 555, 10, 10, 10. Your grandma used to say, "Oh, use 444, and you can grow anything, and then tomatoes come out plump." Just understanding where the sources come from before you start amending it. That's always my big indicator on that. And I know I went down a rabbit hole there, but does that answer your composting question?
Well, yeah, that's super interesting. I thought the point you had made earlier was related to, like, if I'm buying bags of soil that's supposed to be, organic and really beneficial, there's, I forget the name or the acronym, but there's like different certification organizations. So
yes.
Do you think those are generally, is that pretty good, safe material?
By and large, I'd say they're pretty good. I mean, there's a few certification bodies out there that people pay their membership to get the stamp on the bag. If you look at a group called Regenerative doing some terrific work in North America as it relates to certification with CPGs and even on the supply chain for the amendments to the growing. And a lot of that is for the indoor, so controlled environment agriculture, which is even more prone to maybe not being as representative of what's on the bag, which is what's in the bag. And then the difference between liquids and solids, I think, is another key one to think about. The percentages that you have, particularly if you've got a greenhouse scenario and you're putting any kind of liquid nutrient component into maybe an aquaculture setup versus a soil culture but yeah, I'd look at Regenerative. I'd look at I can get a list over to Ben to flag into our VDOC community of some of those bodies. I'd say there's by and large, because I like to believe in humanity, there's more positives than negatives, but there's certainly some ill represented ones out there that potentially I'd stay with.
Okay, great.
I know you've mentioned, not wanting to introduce heavy metals into the soil. What about soils where this is something that already exists and that you're looking to regenerate? Are there natural remedies for pulling those heavy metals out of the ground? Are there specific types of plants that maybe do a really good job at extracting heavy metals from the soil?
Yeah, I mean, basically what you're talking about is phytoremediation. And so sunflowers, Indian mustard, alpine, pennycress, willow trees, these are all phytoremediation plants that help deal with selenium, cadmium, heavy metals, arsenic, uranium that are in soils. You can get into the micro-remediation, which is utilizing fungi to deal with that as well. Mushrooms would be an example of that. That's good, maybe a good path to go down depending on what you know. My first recommendation is make sure you understand what you're dealing with. So do that soil analysis and maybe even do a heavy metal test to really understand what you're dealing with. Going down the microremediation or the fungi remediation process, fungi can have both a positive and an adverse effect. So really, making sure you understand that, particularly if it's going to be food consumption. Oyster mushrooms are pretty good if you're going to deal with mushrooms, but there's some toxicity and toxins. And then bioremediation, just in general, in sort of larger scales, would be something that you can deal, and that's just microorganisms, so microbes in a jug, as it were. And vermiculture is a great example of that. In a liquid form, there are other forms that you can deal with, but I would say, yeah, on a plant base, I like sunflower and Indian mustard. The brassicas tend to be a good place to go when you're dealing with like lead and cadmium, chromium, arsenic. Those are sort of the big ones that happen. Green manures can also, it's probably more on the amendment side of not remediation. You're sort of amending the soils that you're dealing with green manures. So having livestock with manure, and manures have microorganisms breaks down. So that would be sort of a simple path. It's a little bit longer. Clover, white clover, red crimson clover, those are amendments. Their root structures are going to help deal with some of that remediation component. Probably more stabilization. I should actually be really clear. Probably more when you get into amendments, you're more focusing on stabilization than remediation. And so clover, hairy vetch, which I love the name of, and green manures, some cover crop mixtures, and you can really play around with that, are going to stabilize the soil versus remediating them. But those other pieces that I talked about. And then you can get into things like cleation, so adding humic or citric acid to the soil to really sort of knock out and deal with any of the existing heavy metals that are there that we don't get into food production. Now, if you're not doing food production, if you're going to be planting like a forest, or maybe maybe you've got a tree nursery, and those trees are going to be used for landscape purposes. You don't have to go as extensive. I mean, some heavy metals have their natural component that are going to be part of the soil process. So I would look more onto those soil stabilizers versus their full remediation, because they might be pre-existing that are there, and you don't have to worry about them. The forestry component would take care of that itself. Does that help?
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. You mentioned, about some of these plants that'll also take up uranium things. I'm vaguely reminded about an article I recently read about fungi that was found in Chernobyl that was basically breaking down radioactive material. Really
Yeah.
fascinating stuff.
Yeah. Plants are amazing. The interaction with soil and soil that interacts with them. When you start to get down to the root hair structure and what's released from plant, the root exudates, and what the soil takes up, and that highway of nutrient exchange and the science that goes behind that. I mean, you can deep dive on it for years, and people do. So there's a lot out there. Translating that into usable knowledge sometimes can be a bit confusing, but I think conversations like this, where we can take a few nuggets away, and communities like the VDAO, where we can exchange some of these components to our ecosystem, are very, very important to help with that overall process. To maybe better answer your question, Ben, what can we do as a whole? Well, it's groups like this, it's people like this that are taking one or two things away, sharing what's working in different bioregions, and continuing to dialogue around the things that are being beneficial for ecosystem restoration.
Absolutely. If there are any other questions, feel free to either put them in the chat, or again, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. We'll give it about another minute, just being aware of time. It is coming up close to the top of the hour now. Yeah, I mean, really, Neil, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and be here and share your knowledge and wisdom, and give us your insights into what it is to have functional soil health, what functional soil health really is. I not that long ago didn't know the difference between dirt and soil. Coming to find out that dirt is basically it's not alive, it's dead, and soil is very much alive and has a whole complex world around it, within it, that makes it what it is. It allows it to do what it does. So yeah, really appreciate you being here today.
Well, likewise, thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone that's made time to be here, and the dialogue and questions. I'm not far away through the community, part of the community here, and also through Fifth World. So however you want to reach out, there's follow-up questions. I do go onto Discord just about every day, so if you shoot me a message there, it's a great spot to reach me and continue dialoguing. But also, as I mentioned, individuals like Subi and others in our community that have a plethora of knowledge on this topic as well. I think they've got a great resource base within our community as it stands. So.
Yeah, for anybody who's not currently in the VDAO Discord, I highly recommend that you do join. You could really easily do so by finding us on Twitter at joinvdao. Is the Twitter handle, or you could just go to vdao.io. Go to the quick links, and you'll find the Discord link among other links that you'll find available there. Our YouTube, where this recording will be hosted, and some other things, our newsletter, etc. So be sure to go check that out. We do have another Lunch and Learn coming up next month, and that's going to be with Rob Avis, diving into past the solar greenhouses, which is going to be really exciting. Very fitting considering the time. We're starting to shift into that kind of fall and winter mode, and past solar greenhouses kind of allow you to have an extended growing season, especially in the cooler climates. So really looking forward to that.
Do ask him, Rob, about the soil within the microclimate of a past solar greenhouse. Both Rob and I are big fans of in situ growing, so not raised beds within the past solar greenhouse, going right into the soil, and same theory and knowledge. But the past solar greenhouses are creating a microclimate within an ecosystem, and so you can do some very neat things in there. But he's got a lot of wisdom to share there, and I'm excited to be part of that, listen to that Lunch and Learn, and embed some of this knowledge and take over there.
Can't wait. All right. Well, I think that will wrap up for today's session. thanks again, everybody, for joining. Make sure to check out Fifth World as well. Head over to fifthworld.com. You can check out their YouTube. You can find them on LinkedIn. You can also find them on Twitter. So yeah, make sure to follow them on Twitter, and of course follow Neil on Twitter as well at Kohima Farms. Neil, any last words?
No, I just want to thank everyone. I mean, yes, I should say as I start talking. It's a Canadian antidote. Start with the no ones, continue on. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I certainly look forward to continuing to engage with this community and anyone that's not outside of this community. I love talking about soil, so don't hesitate to reach out. I'm not a lawyer; I don't charge by the hour, so it's a passion, and I very much champion all of us as we take this knowledge forward. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Neil. Thanks,
Good afternoon.
Ben.
Yeah.
All right, until next
Ciao.
time.
Ciao. See you later.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.